Pam, thank you for that very beautiful and very moving story. And Mignon, thank you for the hymn you provided. It lays out the case and the situation we face so succinctly. Thank you. Thank you both. First, a confession. I blew it with my weather forecast. It's quite easy to navigate 75% of the parking lot outside and the walkways around the fellowship. So my call was, shall I say, imperfect as far as closing. However, it provides a wonderful lesson that is appropriate for today's message, because it is yet another example of how human beings cannot predict or control Mother Nature, and she will do what she wishes to. And as a side note, I don't think our heating is working very well, so it's about 50 degrees inside this space this morning. We often approach the ecological issue by saying, we should do more. Is there something else we can do? I feel bad because we haven't done as much. Maybe I should try harder in trying to get people to see and understand. Quite often we find ourselves preaching to the choir, talking to those who are already perhaps more knowledgeable than ourselves about the problem and what should be done about it. And in our anxiety to do something, anything, to address the issue, we perhaps find ourselves very burdened to the point, as is the case with some, of saying, I've given up all hope. I think it is valuable to pause and understand the forces we are against, or the forces which oppose us, is a better way of putting it, as we engage in this work of ecological renewal. The first thing we are up against is that people are overwhelmed. COVID, political divisions, social turmoil, the threat of social turmoil, the challenge of trying to survive day to day, of making ends meet, of dealing with loved ones who might have serious or chronic illnesses, of worrying about our children's future, of dealing with the realities of making a living and surviving. These and many other concerns fill the hearts and minds of most people and occupy their thought morning to night. And so for many people, there's absolutely no room, or very little room, to absorb, to understand, to learn, much less to engage in a problem as complex and seemingly overwhelming as climate change. That leaves a small minority of people in our society to be both informed and active in this issue. That, in turn, places an enormous responsibility on elected officials to take constructive actions to make the world a safer place, to build for the future, to deal with this crisis. And therein lies a huge problem. For the second challenge we face is that the fossil fuel industry has enormous resources which they use to control the actions of politicians and to engage in a relentless war and campaign of misinformation and disinformation. We all know about this. We all understand the statement I just made, but we often do not absorb the immense size and influence involved. The way politicians are controlled is through money, of course. Political action committees give about $68 million to incumbent House and Senate members and have done so since the 2018 midterms. About 1/3 of this money, this vast sum of money, went to politicians who 95% of the time vote against any policy or legislation that would be in behalf of ecological betterment. Another almost half of the money goes to candidates and incumbents who have a very high record of voting against climate legislation, to the extent of 90% of the time. The oil and gas companies funnel more cash to climate legislation blockers than any other industry, as we could imagine. In the first quarter of 2021, the oil and gas industry spent more than $81.9 million on lobbying. However, this was a small amount of the money they made. For in 2020, the total revenue in the United States of the oil and gas industry was about $110.7 billion. The fossil fuel industry has been making a lot of money for a very long time. Could you show slide 2, please? Here is how that money is used. The oil and gas industry have an astonishing 3.8 lobbyists per member of Congress. Almost 64% of the oil and gas lobbyists are former government employees. You can take that down. In other words, these lobbyists know people. They know the system. They understand how to work the system, and they are laser focused on destroying any bill or policy that threatens the industry of oil and gas. Now, here's a key point. They are laser focused on undermining and destroying any policy or legislation that is in behalf of a green economy. They don't have the burden of creating policy and legislation and trying to get it voted on positively. All they have to do is undermine it. And undermining something is much, much easier than creating something and then trying to get it passed. In contrast to the decades-long history of money-making of the oil and gas industry, the green economy business is just beginning. They need money, they need investment, they need government help to get them going to a level where they can steadily make money. They have no resources, really, to engage in lobbying. The biggest effort on the green side to do lobbying is the Citizens Climate Lobby. It is bipartisan by self-definition, and lobbies only or principally for a carbon tax. The Sierra Club does a lot of lobbying, and so do associated groups, but these efforts get nowhere near the funding of the fossil fuel lobby. This is an unequal fight. But wait, there's more. For there is an entirely different source and much larger source of money that is also having an extremely powerful effect on climate issues. In 2010, the Supreme Court, in the decision case of Citizens United versus FEC, made it legal for individuals and companies to make virtually unlimited donations and nearly untraceable donations to causes of their choice. This was being done aggressively prior to this decision, but that decision made it legal. This is the so-called dark money. And this dark money goes into what is called super PACs. Slide 3, please. The money involved here is immense. The Center for Responsive Politics reported that these super PACs raised $2.1 trillion in the last political cycle, compared to what was raised in 2018, which is $1.5 trillion. You can take it down. Some of this money has gone into a relentless campaign of disinformation, misinformation, and obstruction. Let me give just one example of this, which is an extraordinarily complex story in itself. A Greenpeace investigation identified Kansas-based Koch Industries of funding 35 groups which then spread misinformation about climate science, led to a sustained assault on climate scientists themselves, and upon green alternatives to fossil fuels. Koch Industries is a $100 billion a year conglomerate dominated by petroleum and chemical interests. Greenpeace says that Koch Industries donated nearly $48 million to climate opposition groups in the period 1997 to 2008, and from 2005 to 2008, it donated $25 million to groups opposed to climate change. They also spent $5.7 billion on political campaigns and $37 million on direct lobbying to support fossil fuels. Show slide 4, please. So, how did they do it? They have a network of lobbyists, former executives, and organizations that create a steady stream of misinformation. The propaganda produced is then replicated, repackaged, and echoed again and again through a Koch-funded web of political front groups and think tanks. Take that down. The groups involved include some of the best known conservative think tanks in the United States, such as Americans for Prosperity, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Manhattan Institute, and the Foundation for Research on Economics and the Environment. The challenge we face is the creation of policies and laws made by our politicians who have been carefully targeted by oil and gas industries so as to control the legislative agenda. The fact is, the cold fact is, that the opinions of our representatives are purchased or rented, if you will, or leased, if you will, through essentially legal bribery offered by special interests in ways that are hidden to the public view. Legislators today don't represent us. They represent the special interests who make it possible for them to stay in power. Our government is not currently, as Lincoln opined, a republic of the people, for the people, by the people. We are facing a situation where big money, dark money, widespread lobbying, and the instinct for survival come together to make a powerful force in an unequal battle. We can fret and fume about it, but it is what it is. How do we acquire the ability to exert pressure and leverage over politicians? What can we do? Well, First of all, let's notice what we are doing. Let's celebrate what we are doing. Let's honor what we are doing. This congregation, for example, has a fantastic committee that is doing a lot of work addressing ecological concerns. I think you are going to soon hear about some of the victories they've been able to accomplish over the last couple of years. We should all be immensely proud of the EcoSolutions Committee and what they are doing. And it's very moving to me when I meet with them and hear and see all that they are doing. Second, we need to be informed and to share information. All the lobbyists in the world cannot defeat our ability to understand, to learn, to share information that is important, to broaden the circle and widen the circle of those who understand what's really going on. Third, we need to really look at our lives, our individual lives, and see how we can change to adjust to a world that is more ecologically friendly. Because the fact is that people notice not what we say, but what we do. And if what we do shows people that we care about this issue, then people will notice. Fourth, we can attempt to change the power dynamic I described above, but I must confess, I do not know how. But I know that there is an answer. I suspect that part of the answer is to work on climate change issues locally, to exert pressure and influence where we have influence and leverage to do so. But allow me to conclude on a positive note. Despite all the disinformation and misinformation that is disseminating relentlessly through our culture, according to a Pew Research Center report, 40% of our population are deeply concerned about the climate issue, 40%. Furthermore, 25% of the population, an additional 25% of the population, see it as a moderately big problem. That means that 65% of the people in this country believe, with varying degrees of intensity, that the climate issue is very relevant and very important and needs to be addressed. That is really significant, given the fact that there's so much disinformation. Also, a green economy in every imaginable way is a good thing. It is our future. It creates job growth. It's good for the economy. It's good for the world. It's good for our children and great-grandchildren. That is not going to change. That is reality. And it's just a matter of how soon we embrace that economy. Another positive thing is technology for a green economy is constantly improving and getting better. Another bit of good news is the infrastructure bill now being implemented will supply billions of dollars, which could be used to cap abandoned well, a major source of emissions, and in other ways mitigate and deal with environmental problems. There is some positive philanthropic giving going in the right direction. Many things are happening that are good and positive. We must never lose heart or lose faith, and we must always be engaged in finding ways to ever more effectively practice our seventh principle, which reads, we do affirm and promote respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And now, as our meditation reading, I'd like to read something written by an old friend of mine named Tom Baugh. He lives in North Carolina in the mountains. And he is a retired U.S. government biologist. And he spent his retirement years engaged deeply in the ecological movement in various ways. And recently he created a reading for the Council of the Order of the Sacred Earth, which is a group led by students of Matthew Fox. And here's what Tom wrote. There is an unfortunate abundance of information that tells us how badly the earth and its systems are faring these days. But there is also some good news. News about a generally unrecognized group of saints and the very real miracles they are working. Although many of them are deeply spiritual people, you probably won't find them dancing around a maypole or involved in arcane rituals or kneeling before an altar. They might be instead kneeling in the mud. Their rituals are measuring stream flow, checking live traps, or counting salamanders, or plants, or elephants for that matter. They don't wear robes or chant sacred verse, but because of them, European bison have been returned to the mountains in Central Europe, rhinos to Botswana, and tiny fish still swim in North American desert springs. These saints are found in many places on earth and come in all colors and hues and genders of humanity. They are known by a number of different names: biologists, ecologists, and perhaps more broadly, conservation biologists. They often work alone or in groups. Their spiritual field might be best known as earth care, and their lives are sometimes threatened and even lost occasionally. They frequently work with men and women known as stewards or rangers or wildlife officers. They are the true saints of this time, and their calling is to save life on earth. Now, saints are often associated with miracles, and many miracles can be attributed to these saints. Take the European bison, for example. At one time, only several dozen of these magnificent animals existed. Now there are hundreds. Very recently, only 30 black rhinoceroses lived as living relics, but they were flown to South Africa, where they have been carefully protected in Botswana to reestablish their endangered species. And those little fish I referred to earlier, they continue to live as a tiny window on the evolution of life on earth. Yes, saints, real saints did this, performing real and verifiable miracles, saving life on earth. Won't you join us?